and thank you for joining us this evening in large numbers because we have a very unique opportunity of having the country's absolute expert on the subject of the psychology in relationship, as judged by the fact that he's both a sage and he's an independent sage, which is, I think, quite a unique distinction. Stephen, I met Stephen when we were doing a very poorly attended interfaith event between the Muslim doctors and the Jewish doctors. And afterwards, I think of the chutzpah that I had to tell him about the Jewish Medical Association, and rather than just to listen to him. So now I'm not going to talk about the Jewish Medical Association or indeed about any of the subjects that he's going to talk to us about because COVID-19 needs no introduction. So, Stephen.
Thank you. One always starts by saying, it's a particular pleasure to talk to you, and one doesn't always mean it. But in this occasion, I do genuinely mean it, because if my fate has panned out as my parents intended, I would be one of you. Like many good Jewish parents, my parents wanted my brother to be a lawyer and me to be a doctor. And indeed, I went along with that, and I applied for medical school, and I got a place. I was to study medicine at Manchester. And I still remember the day that I told my mother on a bus on the Hills Road in Cambridge that I decided to give up my place in medicine and turn to psychology. And my mother burst into tears, and she wailed loudly about how I was destroying my life and destroying her life and destroying everybody's life. But I think it was probably a good decision, because I don't think I would have been a very good doctor. But if anything, I actually chose a more Jewish profession than being a doctor, if that's possible. I became a social psychologist. And the history of social psychology, certainly in the aftermath of 1945, was very much exiled Central European Jewish scholars trying to come to terms with the Holocaust and come to terms with the psychological question it raises of how could it be that people could do that to others, not because of anything they'd done, not because of anything they'd said, but simply because of who they were. How do we understand that human capacity for inhumanity? And all the great names of post-war social psychology, well, most of them are Jewish scholars. Solomon Asch did work on conformity. Stanley Milgram did work on obedience. More recently, Serge Moscovici, a Romanian who went to France, and Henri Tachefel, a Pole who ended up in Britain, in Bristol, where I studied as an undergraduate. Now, Henri's question was that question. It was that question of what makes it possible for people to act in that way towards people simply because of their group membership, simply because they're Jewish, or racism simply because people are black, homophobia simply because people are gay. How could it be? And he developed a rather unique perspective, starting from a radical rethink of the notion of self, that core construct in psychology, but also in philosophy and also in culture. He argued that we define ourselves not only as individuals, not only as I, but in many occasions, what is important to us, as important to us, sometimes more important to us, is being a member of a group, thinking in terms of our social identity. And social identity isn't something secondary. It's not something we come to after the individual self. Indeed, people are prepared to kill and even to die, to sacrifice their individual selves for the group. And he argued that to the extent that the group is so important to us, then if we define ourselves in terms of group membership, and if we want our group membership to be defined positively, we can only do so in comparison to other groups by differentiating against them, by making ourselves better than them. And for many people, Henri's theory, social identity theory, is a theory of discrimination. But if you view it in that way, I think you miss something quite fundamental. In fact, Henri would argue that you would miss something fundamental, which is that it may be that we aim to have positive social identity. We aim to belong to groups that are positively valued. But we live in a world which doesn't make that possible for many people. It was hard to have your Jewishness positively valued if you were in the Germany or much of the Europe of the 1930s. It's hard to be positively valued if you're black in today's society, or a woman, or gay. Many of us exist in situations where we belong to groups that are denigrated. And Henri asked the question, Henri and John Turner, who worked with him, asked the question, how do we respond to that situation? Given that we might have a psychological desire to be positively defined in terms of our group membership, what happens when we find ourselves in negatively valued groups? Do we act individually to try and thrive in society despite our group membership, to pass, to get to the top, even though we are Jewish, black, or women? Or do we challenge the status quo? Do we try and change that inequality? Do we try and alter the intergroup relations? And Henri's insight was that that question is fundamentally attached to the question of when do we act individually, when do we come together collectively? When do we act to pass despite our group membership? When do we assert our group membership and challenge those inequalities? Because if you're a subordinated group member, it is only collectively that you can challenge the status quo. Now, I won't go into the theory, but the point that I want to make is this, that quite remarkably, for Henri, despite his history, he was a Holocaust survivor. In fact, he was in Paris during the war. And he joined the French army. He was a prisoner of war in a prisoner of war camp, always wondering when they would discover he was Jewish and he would pass to other camps. Despite that, despite his experience of the dark side of groups, he saw the positive side. He saw that groups were not only a source of massively negative consequences, but they were the way in which people combated those negatives. If racism is a group phenomenon, then the civil rights movement was the basis on which things began to change. If sexism is a huge negative, it was through the suffragettes and the collective action of women that things changed. Or you can say the same about virtually any group, about Stonewall, and the position of gay people. So his insight was, yes, groups can do terrible things, but groups can be positives. And the reason for that, and this is what I think his theory was all about, was that groups fundamentally are about social power and social change. They have the power to do awful things. They're like dynamite. They can destroy, but they can also be the basis of building as well. So to the extent that we come together as we think of ourselves in terms of shared social identity, then we have the power to be a world-changing force. Now, much of my work over the years has been trying to build on that insight, give substance to that insight, to understand that insight. And there are a number of transformations, psychological transformations, that happen when you start thinking of yourself as a group member. The first is a cognitive shift. You begin to see the world in a different way through the values and the norms and the interests of the group. Rather than all having different views, we begin to align ourselves. We have a common sense of social reality, of the way things are and the way things should be. And there's a wealth of research to show that is so, that when we're in groups, we seek agreement. If you put people down in a single group, then what you see that happens to discussion is this discussion converges because we pick up on points of agreement rather than points of disagreement and gradually converge. So we share a worldview. The second thing that happens is that our social relations change. There is a shift towards intimacy. So for in-group members, we tend to have more respect for them, more trust for them. We give them more support. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Years ago, we did a very little experiment, simple little experiment. You take Manchester United supporters. I'm a Spurs fan, but my brother supports Manchester United, so we'll put up with Manchester United for now. Manchester United fans. And you stress their Manchester United identity. And you ask them to go to another building. And as they go, they see somebody running along, falling over, hurting themselves, who's either wearing a Manchester United shirt, a Liverpool shirt, also red, or a red T-shirt. And they help the person wearing the Manchester United shirt, not wearing Liverpool or a red T-shirt. We help the in-group. But the in-group is flexible. So in a second variant of the study, we do exactly the same thing, but this time they're still Manchester United fans. We stress that they are football fans. And that time, they help the person wearing the Manchester United shirt and the Liverpool shirt, not the person with the red T-shirt. So support. Unless that seemed trivial, shortly after that, I did a study of the rescue of Bulgarian Jews during the Second World War. And as probably you will know, Bulgaria is the only place under Axis control, under Nazi control, where no Jews were deported to the death camps. In fact, there were more Jewish people living in the lands of old Bulgaria. It was different with the annexed lands, but in the lands of old Bulgaria at the beginning. And twice the Nazis tried to deport people, and twice there were mass movements to stop it. And when you look at the texts used to mobilize people, there's a wonderful book called the Fragility of Goodness by Todorov. What you find is people do not talk of the targets as Jewish, as them. They talk of them as Bulgarian, as us, as a national minority. And they stress that this national minority sings the same folk songs, has the same national heroes in Slavyakov, Botev, Pentov. So they are us. They are in-group members. And that's the basis, or one of the bases, one of the core bases of building solidarity. In the in-group, we work together, we have solidarity. There are even other transformations that happen in the group. For instance, if you think about what allows us to be together physically, or at least what keeps us apart physically, often it's disgust, just sheer disgust at the bodily odors of others. So if you do an experiment and you, for instance, get people to smell sweaty T-shirts, that's what I do in my day job. If they're bearing an in-group logo, people find them not particularly disgusting. They stroll over, slowly wash their hands, don't use much soap. But if they're in an out-group T-shirt, they bear, for instance, the logo of a rival university, you find them utterly disgusting. You rush over, you wash your hands, use lots of soap. So again, this notion that in the in-group, we not only share a worldview, but we come together. We have the basis of coaction, of supporting each other. We align the vectors of our energies and our efforts in such a way that we become a powerful force. We coact to achieve our worldview. And that goes a long way to explaining the passion of groups, what Durkheim called effervescence. Often that's put down to mindlessness and a lack of intellect. But what we find is precisely what's going on is that most of the time we live in a world made by others, where our view of the world and our values and our norms aren't enacted. But in the group, we come together, we're empowered, we can turn our identity into a reality, and that's passionate, because in the group we have agency. It's often argued that we lose ourselves as individuals and we lose agency in the group. Precisely the opposite is true. Precisely the opposite is true. We gain agency in the group, and that's what's thrilling about groups. I remember many years ago, some students I had in the seminar, I always say to them when I run my seminar on crowd behavior, go off, experience a crowd. Don't study things you don't experience, you don't understand, you don't know. And they came back in tears of joy. Now, students sometimes have tears in my lectures, but it's not often tears of joy. And I said, well, look, well, why? Why are you so excited? And they said, this is many years ago, it was 2005. They said, we went to the Make Poverty History demo. Been in Edinburgh that year because there was a G7 summit, Glen Eagles. And they said, for the first time in our lives, we were telling governments what to do. We live in a world where governments tell us what to do. For once, we were empowered to do the opposite. So groups are passionate things. And they're passionate things because they're things in which we have agency. We have agency because we have power. And we have power because we come together around a common vision. Now, what on earth, you may be thinking, has that got to do with COVID and with the present situation of the world? Because on the whole, when people think of behavior in emergencies and in disasters, they think of precisely the opposite of what we've been talking about, or what I've been talking about, rather. There is this notion of human fragility, that the human psychological apparatus is at best rather weak. We're not very good, we are told, at complicated information. We're not very good at handling uncertainty. We're not very good at handling probability, and particularly in a crisis, when pressure is heaped upon us, we crack, we panic. And no Hollywood disaster film would be any good without a scene with people running, screaming, waving their hands in the air and clogging up the exits and turning a crisis into a tragedy. And it's a very strong view, this view of human frailty in the case of crisis. And in fact, we saw it in this pandemic. At the beginning, you will remember all the talk of behavioral fatigue. The notion was that in that fateful week between the 16th and the 23rd of March, that we should delay lockdown on the grounds that people couldn't cope for very long, and therefore you couldn't impose it too early. And it was a fateful week because according to some of the modelling, in delaying for that week, we probably lost tens of thousands of lives. And it was wrong. What we found was precisely the opposite. What we found was a remarkable resilience amongst people. There was one study by Bobby Duffy and his group at King's College London in about May, showing that over 90% of people were complying with the lockdown of the period, 91%. But of those, half, 44%, were suffering considerably. Suffering psychologically, suffering materially, economically, and yet they still went along with lockdown. If anything, what was interesting was the contrast between a government which said people were too weak to deal with lockdown and a government which supposedly would look after us and shepherd us given our weakness. And the contrast was brought home to me on the day when Dominic Cummings gave his press conference. If you remember, Cummings, understandably, according to Boris Johnson, put himself and his family before the regulations and drove to Durham because he was in a situation of difficulty. On that day, I don't know if any of you watched Channel 4 News that night, they had another story. And it was a story of a family, a black family, single parent. The mother had COVID, too ill to look after children. The 10-year-old was looking after the 3-year-old. All the food they have, because they were poor, was watered down baked beans. And yet that girl was strong enough to understand that she had to go along with lockdown because it was for the good of the community. And when people showed that resilience, that remarkable resilience, because it went against the grain so much, there was always a whiff of exceptionalism about it. People would say, oh, well, yes, people normally crack, but we're different. British people are different. The Blitz spirit. And elsewhere, they invoked other exceptionalism. In New York, they said, yes, well, other people, are weak, but we're not. The New York spirit, 9/11 and all that. But the fact is that actually, when you look to the literature and the study of disasters, what you find is that panic is very rare. Panic doesn't tend to happen. People don't run for the exits. They don't overreact. They don't abandon each other. Characteristically, people behave proportionately, calmly, look after each other. Often if people die, it's because they refuse to leave, leaving others behind. Often that will be a matter of family and friends, but often it's strangers as well. And why does that happen? About 15 years ago, myself and a colleague, John Drury, did a number of studies, had a project looking at disasters. We looked at things like the 7/7 bombings of 2005 in London and various other disasters. And again, we found what others had found. You didn't find panic. We found people supporting each other. If you read the report on 7/7, you will see the amazement of the emergency services when they turned up in the tube expecting people to be completely beside themselves, panicking, not able to, and found that people were organized and were helping each other sometimes by talking to each other, sometimes elementary first aid, triage was going on, people were organized. And why were they organized? Well, because what happened in a disaster, in a situation where we have a common experience, a common fate, you see the emergence of a sense of shared identity. You see the creation of a psychological group in the event. It's stronger if there are pre-existing psychological groups to draw on, but you can have the spontaneous generation of these groups. And that shared identity is the basis for solidarity. And that solidarity is what allows people to feel able to cope, indeed to cope, both practically and psychologically. And by now, both John and myself have done a number of studies around the world in different places using experimental methods and survey methods, ethnographic methods, to show how powerful this process is. It's not unique to the West. Take a very different country. I just had a PhD student who was Chinese and who studied the huge 2008 earthquake in central China. And we thought, well, we need to be careful about being ethnocentric and applying our Western models on very different cultures. But he found exactly the same thing, that in the earthquake, the divisions disappeared as people began to feel that common fate. Well, that even though they could have died by doing so, they would spend as much time desperately trying to excavate collapsed houses to save others and others' children as they would put into their own children and saving their own children. That divisions between the local authorities and local bureaucrats and the community disappeared. And so you see this contrast between the assumption of individual fragility and the reality of collective resilience. Resilience then isn't a quality within the individual. It's not something that we have or don't have. It's something that happens between us. And it happens between us because if others become an asset to us rather than an impediment, if we can rely on others to help us, it gives us precisely that sense of confidence, of empowerment, of efficacy, which increases our coping. The reason, in fact, why I met David was we had become involved in work on mass gatherings medicine. And mass gatherings medicine is dominated by Saudi Arabia for the simple reason that probably one of the greatest mass gatherings in the world is the Hajj, where people from over 160 nations come together. And the huge fear is that in coming together, they will bring disease together and then they will spread it throughout the world. Before COVID, the huge fears were over SARS and MERS, and that the event that would spread it, the super spreading event, would be the Hajj. Now, we've done a lot of work on mass gatherings. In fact, most of the work that we did was on another mass gathering that happens in North India, the Magh Mela in Allahabad, which is, many people will argue, the largest event on earth. Every year, people gather for the month of Magh in their millions. It's on a 12-year cycle. On the 12th year, over 100 million people gather for the Mela. On a single day, you can have over 20 million people around you. It's the most extraordinary thing. And by every assumption of mainstream psychology and indeed medicine, you'd have thought it would be bad for you. It's insanely crowded, and crowding, we know, is bad for you psychologically. It's insanely noisy to the extent that the noise levels, according to WHO guidelines, should cause you damage after 45 minutes. This thing goes on for a month, day in, day out, night and day. And as for hygiene, well, let me just say that if you put your feet in the Ganges, do not ask what is floating by them. And yes, for sure, a number of people do get diseases and the level of diseases is higher. But overall, if, to put it technically, the bugs don't get you, actually your well-being is increased. And why is your well-being increased? Because despite all these negatives, the fact that you are in a group, the fact that you have this sense of shared identity, and the fact that that sense of shared identity endures after the event, and that sense of coping and empowerment lowers stress and improves well-being. Now let's look at the power of the group in the context of COVID. And I want to point to 3 ways in which it's absolutely critical. At the beginning, I was looking back today, we wrote this in early March. We wrote a piece saying, don't personalize, collectivize. And our argument was that to the extent that you nurture this sense of shared identity, you address people in collective terms, you talk to people, you bring people together as a group, it will increase adherence, because adherence is about doing things not for yourself, but for the group. If I get you to think in terms of individual risk, and you're young and you're healthy, you might think to yourself, well, you know, I don't risk much by going out, and I risk a hell of a lot by staying in, because being young, I can't stand staying in with my parents. I have a 16-year-old next door, he could tell you that. So the cost-benefit analysis says to you, go out. If you think in terms of individual identity, but if you think in terms of collective identity, in terms of us rather than I, then the calculation changes fundamentally, because if you go out, you may well kill vulnerable members of the group, and that completely outweighs the problem of staying inside. And so the cost-benefit analysis changes as your concept of self changes. Now, that was a conceit, that was something that we assumed based on prior theoretical knowledge. As time has gone by, there are more and more studies which show precisely that. Even in May, work from the LSE showed that individual calculations of risk did not relate to adherence. What related to adherence was a sense of community and a belief we want to get out of this as a community. Just 2 weeks ago, a study was published, 67 nations, 47,000 people involved, showing that sense of connection to the national community, not jingoistic patriotism, my country right or wrong, we're the greatest nation of earth, but simply a sense of connection to others in the national community predicted and was one of the best predictors of adherence. And similarly, there are studies showing that a sense of identification with the local community is critical to adherence. So shared identity, this abstract concept, is at the core of adherence behaviors. And as we know, in the end, actually, I used to say until we get a vaccine, but I'll qualify that. Behavioural interventions are the main way we deal with this pandemic, getting people to stay physically apart, to wear masks, to adopt hygiene measures and so on. And even when we get a vaccine will solve nothing. Getting vaccinated might. And as we know already, the polls suggesting that only about 50% of people say they will get vaccinated. So again, the behavioural dimension is completely central to what's going on. So that's the first dimension. of why shared identity and the power of the group is so important to getting us through this pandemic. The second reason, probably all of you will have had experience of, the way in which neighbours would drop notes to each other saying, "Can I help you if you need any help? We'll give it." Street level WhatsApp groups, again, seeing if anybody needed any help. Do you need some shopping picked up? Can you help me in some way or another? The 4,100 mutual aid groups which sprang up and down the country, involving more than 3 million people, the million people who volunteered for the NHS. Again, at the moment we have a project, we're looking at these groups, and a sense of shared identity is critical to the formation and the maintenance of these groups. And in many ways, the point is that the state can't look after everybody in a pandemic. There's simply not enough policemen, fire officers, social workers and so on to go round. They can't deliver to everybody who needs food delivering to them. And therefore, the fluorescence of these groups based on this sense of shared identity is absolutely critical to getting us through the pandemic. Indeed, in many ways, if anything good comes out of this pandemic, I hope it will be the maintenance and understanding of the importance of community self-organization, supported and scaffolded by the state, not an excuse to cut funding for social services, but precisely funded to support people to support each other, but immensely powerful and immensely important, again, showing us the power of the group in the pandemic. And the third point is this. I think one of the tragedies of this pandemic in terms of how we've handled it was the term social distancing. Because while physical proximity can kill, and we don't want people to be physically too proximate, equally, social distancing can kill. There's a remarkable literature that's grown up on what's been called the social cure, the relationship between groups and physical and mental health. Some remarkable findings. If, on retirement, you lose two social groups, your occupational group and perhaps another group involved in your work, you have a 16% chance of dying within 2 years. If you join two groups, join the golf group, join a drinking group, doesn't matter what it is, your chances of dying within the next 2 years is 0.5%. Depression, if you join one group, then these are prospective studies. Over the next 5 years, the chance of you getting depressed decreased by 20%, and that increases up to about 50 or 60% as you join more groups. In many ways, the power of the group, both for physical and mental health, is probably stronger than virtually any pill we've ever invented. So again, that sense of keeping us together as a group, or that sense of connection, what is a remarkably powerful prophylactic against the stresses and strains of the pandemic. So the group is so important. But as I've intimated, that shared identity is fragile. It can be scaffolded by government, it can be undermined by government, easily undermined by government. And I think, sadly, there have been a number of incidents where that has happened. I've already alluded to the Cummings affair. In the week after the Cummings affair, a week, 7 days, trust in the UK government plummeted by only over 20%. The pollsters shook their head. They'd never seen anything like it. And now, trust in the Scottish government stands at about 70 to 75%, around 3/4. In the UK government, it's about 1/4 to 1/3. But it's not just that their actions have, if you like, divided themselves from the rest of the community and thereby undermined their influence. I fear that at the moment, what we're seeing is the emergence of a number of trends which are fracturing that shared identity amongst the public. We shouldn't overdo it. One of the dangers, for instance, of the media is, of course, the media love a good story about violation rather than rule following. A big house party makes a good headline. People sitting quietly at home doesn't. So they will report on the violations, ignore the rule following, and as a result, they will create a false view of the levels of discord, which can become a self-fulfilling prophecy because it leads to a norm where people think that others aren't conforming, so they think, why should we? Today, some Mori polling came out and it confirms what's been shown time and time again, that the great majority of people are complying, about 75%. And that the great majority of people think we should take the pandemic more seriously, not less seriously. And the majority of people think the government is relaxing too much, not imposing too much upon us. But one of the big concerns that I have at the moment is what is growing up as a blame narrative. Very powerful blame narrative, both from the government and the media. And according to that narrative, that if you are infected, the implication is that you've done something wrong. You've misbehaved in some sort of way. And if you misbehaved, then you are to be blamed. And if you are the sort of person who misbehaves, then the only way of bringing you back in line is through punishment. So we have that sense of, first of all, individualizing the explanation of infection, secondly, blame, and thirdly, punishment. Now, I think, first of all, this is profoundly misleading. We know that you get infected through exposure. And exposure can come as much from following the rules as from breaking the rules. The government urged people to go back to work. Government urged people to go to the pub and to socialize for the sake of the economy, to eat out, to help out. And the groups who became infected, young people, are those who are most likely to not to be able to work at home, but to work in public facing jobs like hospitality, retail. They're the ones who are most likely to be on public transport because they don't have their own cars. They're the ones who are far by far most likely to live in multi-occupancy flats and therefore get more exposed. But the assumption was that if young people have got infected, it's because young people have misbehaved. It's because of house parties. They're all out having house parties. And therefore, Matt Hancock urged these terrible young people to get themselves in hand and not kill their grannies. And what was the solution to these problems? People not self-isolating, for instance, it was £10,000 fines. And now we learn that if you test positive, then your details are being given to the police. So this narrative of blame and punishment. And what does it do? Well, it does a number of things, not least to try and take attention away from the fact that people might not have misbehaved and broken rules, but followed bad rules. So it's a way of deflecting accountability from the government for the mistakes it made in opening up too quickly, but it does a number of other things. First thing it does is it alienates people profoundly. If you set people up as an out group, you say, you're the problem, right? You're the other that we should blame. You stand outside society. You can't influence people. You're not going to convert them. You're going to alienate them. If anything, you're going to get them to go further in rejecting you. The first rule of social influence is you can't influence people from the position of an out group. If you set people up as an out group, you'll lose influence over them. So that's the first thing. Second thing you will do is to make others complacent. If we are told that the problem is demonic, bad young people with all their house parties, then other people are going to say, oh, well, it's not me. I'm not one of them. I'm not bad. I might be interpreting the rules. I might be bending the rules. I might be having a dinner party with 7 or 8 people, but I'm not one of those young people. Unless that seemed fanciful, I was in a meeting the other day with the Scottish police, and they came up with some remarkable figures. They've been in the last few days to 440 house gatherings. Of those, 13, under 2%, involved 15 or more people. The great majority was precisely people having 1 or 2 more people around than they should. And when the police banged on their doors and said, look, what are you doing? They were outraged and said, look, we're not the problem. Why are you knocking on our doors? We're not having parties. So you make people complacent. You make the rules not relevant to us. It's about that other. And the third thing you do is that you divide people. You set people against each other, and we're beginning to see those divisions. Again, a study of the other day showed that if you ask people who adhere what they think of non-adherent people and vice versa, the bitterness is greater than between Leavers and Remainers in Brexit. We're beginning to divide people and set people against each other and create conflict. We're beginning to destroy that sense of shared identity. And rather than doing that, rather than setting people up as the other, rather than assuming people are people of bad will, and a different way of going about things is to recognize that actually what we're asking of people is extremely difficult. Let's take the most glaring example of all, that of people self-isolating, and the figures showing that 18% of people self-isolate. And remember, those figures relate to people who are symptomatic. Probably people who are contacts, who are non-symptomatic, are adhering at about 10% levels. And that being true, the whole testing system is pointless. Testing people achieves nothing. Tracing contacts achieves nothing unless people self-isolate. That's the point of the system. It's the only point of the system. But self-isolation is a very difficult thing to do. There is the financial dimension to it. You might lose your job. You might, well, you're almost bound to lose income. What if you live in a multi-generational, multi-occupancy house with other vulnerable people? How do you self-isolate then? What if you've got caring responsibilities? You've got children, an elderly relative outside the house. What do you do about that? How do you get food delivered? What if you're on your own? What about your mental health? If instead of seeing people as a problem and saying you're to blame and waving a stick at them, you asked, how can we support and we can help you? Thus, authority stops being the other who punishes you, but actually begins to be seen as of the group and for the group supporting us. Under those conditions, you not only practically make it possible for people to adhere, you create the conditions of influence of authority and the population being in group on which people are motivated to adhere. So I would argue that if you want to maintain that sense of unity and to motivate people, we need to shift from a punitive perspective to a supportive and facilitative perspective. And I just want to finish with this point. Fundamentally, the point I'm making is that the power of the group and the power of the public in any situation, but in this pandemic, is the most powerful resource we have to deal with this pandemic. And if government wants to deploy that group membership, deploy that social force, it needs to be seen as part of the group. We've got to move from that traditional notion of people as weak and needing to be shepherded, the people as the problem in a pandemic, to understand people as the solution in a pandemic. And if you understand the psychology of groups, and if you use the psychology of groups, and if you create a common group membership amongst the public and with authority, we will be in a far, far better position to deal with this pandemic. So I apologize for having gone on for far too long, I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's an interesting point. The people you are motivating surely are your colleagues on stage and the government. How does one motivate the government to actually do this to actually adopt your point of view?
Well, that's a very good question. One answer is to get a different government. So,
given the fact that that's not
okay, so that was flippant. I have an interesting experience of being involved in the behavioural science advice to the UK government, but also being involved in the advisory group to the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland. And Scotland being a smaller country, you're far closer to the decision making, and you can see the impact of what you do. So, you know, there are times where we've had meetings with Nicola Sturgeon to talk through these issues because she's very interested. And I think we've seen in Scotland much more of the approach which I've been talking about. I think there has been some influence there. When I look at the UK government, there are various things which, from a scientific point of view, are really hard to understand. So one thing that is really hard to understand, I think, is the testing system, and the fact that despite the constant failures of this centralized and privatized system, they stick with it, even though, you know, there's failure after failure after failure, and they consistently fail to meet their targets every week, and it's getting worse. So why don't they go, as nearly every public health person I talk to says, why don't they go towards a system based on local public health? Because after all, you know, contact tracing is an act of detective work. How can you be a detective from a call center hundreds of miles away when you don't know the patch at all? It seems ridiculous. And the only answer seems to be ideology, an ideology which is obsessed with the private over the public sector. And when I look and I ask myself the question, why in June, when they reopened, didn't they make sure that places were safe, a proper regulatory system to make sure that workplaces and hospitality is COVID secure, to support people by showing them how to do it, but also to inspect? Instead, they just said to employers, and they said to hospitality owners, well, you just make it safe. And many did, because many of the employers are deeply committed, but some didn't. Why didn't they use regulation? And I think if you had more regulation, you'd need less limitation. I think it's ideology. Again, it's a laissez-faire ideology. And finally, why are they doing things like, you know, talking in bombastic terms about everything they're going to do and how marvelous it is? Why don't they admit their mistakes and reset things? And I think it relates to a paternalism which I've described as this view of people being frail, but, you know, people can't cope with hard truth. You know, people are like children, and you can't let them know that mummy and daddy are fallible. I think it's an ideology of paternalism. So, as I say, that ideological commitment to the private sector, that laissez-faire ideology, and that paternalism are the only ways I can make sense of them continuing to do things which patently, in terms of the evidence, are counterproductive and don't make sense.
Right. The one question that's come through is the question about the relative impact of the media and media influences. How do media influences, how do they and how could they operate at the interface?
That's an excellent question. And one of the things I've wondered is, why haven't the government done more to talk to the media? Because in some areas, the media do have a quite considerable sense of social responsibility, say around suicide. They don't report suicides because they understand that that can lead to more suicides, to an increase in suicides. And I think there are a number of ways in which the media have been unhelpful. So, for instance, I pointed to the way in which that focus on the spectacular and the violations, you know, on the house parties and so on, can create social norms which undermine efforts against the pandemic. And again, one of the findings about human behavior more and more is, we think that if you want to understand how people behave, then look at their own opinions. Our own opinions surely drive our behavior. So we have millions and millions of opinion polls. But there's a lot of research that shows that even more important than our opinions, what we think can be what we think that others think. Because if we think that what we believe is at odds with the community, we won't do it. Okay. There's a brilliant study that was done on the media and reconciliation in Rwanda, and it involved setting up a soap opera about reconciliation. And what was found was that actually this soap opera had a real effect in terms of people's willingness to take part in reconciliation activities. Not that it changed anybody's individual view, it just changed what they thought that other people thought. And so if you tell everybody everybody else is partying, everybody else is violating the rules, it creates what we call a descriptive norm, which undermines compliance. And I think that's a really big issue. To take an example, do you remember, all the stuff about covidiots, congregating in parks? Well, first of all, it wasn't clear that they were idiots. A lot of people were doing what they were told that they could do, go out, and there was limited space, and they found themselves in spaces that were crowded despite themselves. But a lot of the time, the media exacerbated that with long telephoto lenses, which compressed things and made people look more crowded than they actually were. There was, it fitted with a journalistic notion of what makes something attractive and what makes something newsworthy to do things in that way. So I think that's one way in which the media have been negative. Another way I think in which the media have been negative has been this blame narrative, spreading and increasing this blame narrative. And I really fear this blame narrative, because one of the things is that if you individualize things, then the consequence is that you say those who are more likely to be infected are bad and wrong and have done something wrong. Now, given that we know that the more deprived are more likely to be exposed, that vulnerable groups and marginal groups are more likely to be exposed, inevitably that leads to a situation in which minorities are blamed in particular. And we've seen the rise, just yesterday, the rise in hate crimes, 25% increase in hate crimes, increasing narratives spreading on the internet, blaming various minorities, Black people, Muslims, but also, there have been, and you will know more than I suspect, because I'm a long way away, but, leaflets circulating, blaming Jewish people near Stamford Hill about, acting in ways that are irresponsible and congregating in ways that are irresponsible. So this blame narrative is problematic in general terms. It very easily slips into blame against particular minorities and therefore leads into specific forms of discrimination and hate crime. So again, I think that's an area where we need far more understanding. And I don't necessarily think it's the press being malicious. I think it's the press not fully understanding and appreciating these issues. And I think a dialogue with the press, not to suppress free speech, not to say you can't say these things, but to get them to be more aware of the consequences of that form of communication is really important.
That's one of the questions that has come up online, is the question about the Stamford Hill community and the Haredi community. Where do they fall into your spectrum of community versus individual, and how are they? Would they be a group worthy of study?
I think there would be a fascinating group worthy of study. And I think, clearly they're a very strong and a very cohesive group with a very strong sense of identity. Now, of course, the way any group behaves is always going to be a function of, first of all, how it sets the boundaries of its group and how it sees itself as part of a common group with others. And secondly, a function of the particular norms and values of that group. So there are common processes to the way in which different groups behave, but the actual outcomes of those processes, the parameters that feed into them, are going to be culturally specific. So for instance, we've been doing research in Scotland on the experience of Muslim communities, and we've done, and it's part of a project where we're also working with people in Hungary and Serbia and Romania, looking at the experience of Roma communities under COVID-19. And one of the things that interests us is the extent to which they have a sense of being part of a national community, the voices they listen to and don't listen to, the extent to which they have a sense of commonality with others, and so on. So certainly these are empirical questions, and I think they're very important empirical questions.
But there's no straight answer at the moment.
Well, as I say, if I make a statement like when people act in terms of social identity, when a social identity is salient, they act in terms of the norms and values of that group. It's both a general statement about process, But it's also a statement of particularity because different groups will have different norms and values. So what the process explanation does is it tells you what are the factors you need to look to and to investigate in order to understand behavior. So at one level, it might seem vague, but at another level, it is, if you like, precise about the processes and the parameters. But as with a mathematical equation, you don't know the outcome of that equation until you know the specific parameters. And if I could claim to be as precise as a mathematical equation, I'd be quite pleased.
There are two more. So if we detain you just a little longer, one is the question of what do you feel about the Lord Sumption approach, the approach which is usually referred to as the Swedish approach, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, it's not the Swedish approach, you see. I mean, the Swedish approach is really interesting in that actually they had a whole series of forms and regulations. The language of lockdown is really unhelpful. It's unhelpful, first of all, actually, because I wouldn't call it lockdown because it sounds punitive. It sounds as if you're punishing people, and so it's not surprising that people are resistant to it. If we thought about it as local support measures for those who are have high levels of infection, I think we'd be going down a very different path. So we lump all sorts of different things together, which are in fact very different. In some ways, the Swedes had more restrictions than we had. For instance, their teaching, their 16 and 17-year-olds at school do online teaching. They're not in class and so on. But if you want me to talk more generally about you know, what sometimes, yes, the herd immunity strategy, I suppose my reaction to it is I don't see it as a scientific point of view. It's not giving you an alternative analysis of the evidence. It's not, you know, they don't reference their arguments. It's much more a statement of values. And when you look at, you know, what lies behind it. So for instance, the declaration, the Great Barrington Declaration was in Great Barrington because it is the headquarters of a hard right US libertarian organization, which doesn't believe in the NHS apart from anything else. And as you, again, you'll know more than I do, that nearly every single organization not only rejects but deplores such a view: the WHO, the CDC, the ECDC, BMA, and so on and so forth. And the reason I think is so many of the assumptions, the value assumptions in it, are just false. So first of all, you know, the notion that it's fine to lock away all vulnerable people, which, depending on how you define it, is 25 to 30% of the population, including a lot of us. I'm 65 next year, so I would be locked away from January. The assumption that you can separate people to make sure that infection doesn't spread into the vulnerable. Well, I'm a keen cyclist. I've been looking at the Tour of Italy, which is on at the moment. And they have tried to have a secure bubble. They've put all the resources they can into separating out these cyclists, but they've had to send home 2 teams because it's almost impossible to, you know, to isolate with all the resources in the world 100 people. Well, if you're trying to isolate 20, 30 million with far less resource, it's a ridiculous conceit. The notion that it's fine to send young people out, and remember, those who are more likely to get the disease are those more exposed. It is going to be the poorer, it is going to be the more marginal, it is going to be the ethnic minorities who get more exposed. A substantial number of them will die. So even if you take the incident rates at the present, amongst 19 to 59-year-olds, it would mean 25,000 people dying and probably 250,000 people in the NHS, which would overwhelm the NHS. And on top of that, it's long COVID. So all that, when A, we don't know whether we can get immunity, and B, the alternative which they set up is as hard lockdown isn't the alternative. In fact, my sense of it is that the herd immunity argument, and we've seen it, the herd immunity argument has been used to delay the response at the moment. When Gendrick was asked about why they didn't follow the sage advice, he said, oh, well, some scientists say one thing, another say another. So we fudged, okay? And the more you fudge, And the more the infections spike, the more that we will need more extreme control measures, in other words, hard lockdown, to deal with things. So from my point of view, herd immunity and hard lockdown actually substantially are two sides of the same coin. The alternative would be a sensible and proportionate and systematic public health response. I mean, my feeling is we do need to do something urgently to stop the infections, and we need to use that time for a reset to have a test and trace system based on local public health, to have measures to support people to self-isolate, and to have a robust regulatory system. With those in place, I think we can live with the virus, both allowing the economy to function and supporting public health and allowing us to live a relatively normal life. So there are alternatives. And I think the notion of herd immunity is both immoral and unnecessary.
Right. There are two final questions. One question is there a difference to where age people actually respond in your concept of the group versus the individual? And the second question is, how come people respond to conspiracy theories about COVID-19, and how do they manage to respond to these conspiracy theories that is obviously not valid?
Okay, so age and social identity. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, the developmental work has looked at children and shows that, you know, with children, you do get these social identity processes emerging fairly early, 6, 7, 8. In terms of older age, there is no work I know which systematically asks, are we more liable to identify in terms of social groups at different ages? It could be that your temporal perspective changes, so you might look back and be more nostalgic as you get older and be less forward-looking. So it might be that the specific groups which you find attractive and willing to invest in are going to be different. But I think it is more what groups you identify with rather than do you identify with groups that changes with age. In terms of conspiracy theories, well, epistemically, we live in a world where we have to make decisions about a lot of things that we don't directly know about. And in a globalized world and an ever more technological world, it's ever more true. So if you take a vaccine, for instance, I'm not a doctor. Well, actually, I am. My dad used to say to me, he said, look, psychology is a waste of time. You're wasting your life. But he said, get your doctorate so I can say my son's a doctor. Well, okay, I'm a doctor, but I can't tell you, is this vaccine safe or not? I have to trust others. Okay. And in a lot of our life, the information we're given, we have to make a decision on, do we trust the source of that information? And that's always been true. Okay, and I think actually epistemically it's necessarily true that the use of information is a function of our knowledge and our trust in the source. What has changed is politically who we see as in-group or out-group, and hence who we trust has changed. So, for instance, during Brexit was based very much on this populist notion of the people against the elite, and politicians were put in the elite, and Michael Gove famously put experts in the elite as well as out-group. So what shifted is not this notion of trusting people as a function of whether they're in-group or out-group, it's which groups are in-group and which groups are out-group, and experts, academics, and to some extent scientists, by some people are put in that out-group elite category. It's no more than about 20%. Still about 80% of people trust scientists. That's the good news. But for 20% of people, they believe that these people are the out group. We can't trust a thing that they say because they're serving interests that are alien to us. So the question about conspiracy theories and the question of trust, and therefore, how do we get people to, for instance, take vaccines, doesn't come down to giving them the information per se, because they don't trust the source of that information. It comes down to